On April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. 1,500 people died in one of history's most famous maritime disasters. For over a century, we've been told it was inevitable, a tragic accident, an act of God, the ship that even God couldn't sink, meeting its fate in the dark waters. But what if I told you the Titanic didn't have to sink? What if there was a technology that could have saved every single person on board? What if the White Star Line knew about it, chose not to use it, and then spent decades covering up that decision? Today, we're uncovering the invention that could have prevented the Titanic disaster and the corporate greed that sent 1,500 people to their deaths. Let's go back to 1907. The White Star Line, one of Britain's most prestigious shipping companies, was in trouble. Their competitor, Cunard Line, had just launched two record-breaking ships, the Lusitania and Mauretania. They were faster, more luxurious, and stealing White Star's wealthy passengers. White Star needed to respond, but they couldn't compete on speed. Cunard had that market cornered. So they decided to compete on something else: size and luxury. The plan was audacious: build three massive sister ships, bigger than anything ever constructed. Fill them with unparalleled opulence. Make them floating palaces that would make Cunard's ships look like cargo vessels. And most importantly, market them as unsinkable. The first ship was named Olympic, the second Titanic, the third would be Britannic. The designer was Thomas Andrews, a brilliant naval architect. The builder was Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast. The budget was astronomical. But there was a problem. To make the ships truly unsinkable, they would need the most advanced safety features available. And those features existed. For decades, naval engineers had been developing watertight compartment systems, double-hull designs, and collision-resistant bulkheads that extended all the way to the top deck. One design in particular had proven extraordinarily effective. It had been tested, demonstrated, and was available for use. If implemented fully, it would make a ship virtually impossible to sink, even with massive hull damage. Thomas Andrews knew about these systems. He recommended them. The White Star Line executives looked at the cost, an additional £50,000. Then they looked at the trade-off. Some first-class cabin space would need to be sacrificed. The grand staircase might need to be slightly smaller. A few luxury features would have to be reduced. They made their decision. No. The advanced safety systems were too expensive and would compromise the luxury experience for their wealthiest passengers. Instead, they would implement a cheaper, partial version: watertight compartments that didn't extend high enough, bulkheads with gaps, a system that looked impressive in marketing materials but had fatal flaws. And then they marketed it as unsinkable anyway. Here's what they actually built. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments separated by bulkheads. That sounds impressive. The marketing department loved it. But here's the problem. The bulkheads only extended up to E-deck, not all the way to the top of the ship. Think of it like this. Imagine an ice cube tray. Each section is separated by a wall. But those walls don't go all the way to the top. If you fill one section too full, the water spills over into the next section. Then that one overflows into the next, and so on. That's exactly what the Titanic's compartments did. The ship could survive flooding in up to 4 compartments. That was the design spec. And to be fair, that was more than any previous ship. But if more than 4 compartments flooded, the water would spill over the bulkheads, flooding the next compartment, then the next, in a cascading failure that was mathematically inevitable. Thomas Andrews knew this. He argued for taller bulkheads that extended to the uppermost deck. He argued for a true double-hull design. He argued for additional safety features. The White Star Line said no. Every time. Why? First-class passengers were paying the equivalent of $100,000 in today's money for their suites. They expected unobstructed luxury. Taller bulkheads meant more structural walls cutting through their space. Profit won, safety lost. And there's something else that's rarely discussed. Lifeboats. The Titanic had lifeboat capacity for 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on board. That's barely half. British maritime law at the time required lifeboats based on a ship's tonnage, not passenger capacity. The Titanic actually exceeded legal requirements, but everyone in the industry knew that regulation was outdated and inadequate. Thomas Andrews and other designers recommended enough lifeboats for everyone on board. The answer was no. Too many lifeboats would clutter the first-class promenade deck and spoil the view. Again, luxury over life. April 14th, 1912. A calm, clear, moonless night in the North Atlantic. The Titanic was 4 days into its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. It was traveling at nearly top speed, about 22 knots, despite multiple ice warnings from other ships. Why so fast in known ice fields? The White Star Line wanted to make headlines. Arriving early in New York would generate publicity. Speed impressed investors and passengers. Safety took a backseat to spectacle. Again. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead. An iceberg. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard to starboard and full astern on the engines. The ship began to turn. It wasn't enough. 37 seconds after the warning, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side, below the waterline, for about 300 feet. The damage didn't look catastrophic. No massive hole. Just a series of narrow slits and buckled plates along 6 watertight compartments. Thomas Andrews was summoned. He inspected the damage and did the math. The ship could survive 4 flooded compartments. 6 were flooding. His conclusion was mathematical certainty. The Titanic would sink. He estimated 2 hours, maybe less. Captain Smith asked if there was any way to save her. Andrews shook his head. If the bulkheads had extended higher, if they'd used the advanced safety systems, if they'd implemented the designs he'd recommended, the ship would survive. But they hadn't. And now, 2,224 people were on a sinking ship with lifeboats for barely half of them. What happened next was chaos, heroism, and ultimately, tragedy. The crew began loading lifeboats. But there was a problem. There had been no lifeboat drill. Passengers didn't know their stations. Crew members weren't trained. Many lifeboats launched half-empty because nobody was sure if they could hold their full capacity. Lifeboat 1 had a capacity of 40 people. It launched with 12. Women and children were prioritized, but the implementation was inconsistent. Some lifeboats took only women and children. Others took men too. Some took first-class passengers, while third-class families were still trying to find their way to the boat deck. Why? Because the ship's design segregated classes so thoroughly that third-class passengers had to navigate locked gates and unfamiliar passages to reach the lifeboats. Many never made it. The ship's band famously played on the deck to keep people calm. Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, knowing his ship and his decisions were sending people to their deaths. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's stern rose into the air. The lights went out. The ship broke in two and sank. Over 1,500 people went into the freezing Atlantic water. Most died within 15 minutes from hypothermia. The few lifeboats that were out there had space for hundreds more people, but only one lifeboat went back to look for survivors. One. Why? The survivors in the lifeboats feared being swamped by desperate swimmers, so they rowed away from the screaming and waited for it to stop. By dawn, when the Carpathia arrived, 1,500 people were dead. 705 survived. The sinking of the Titanic was international news. The world demanded answers. Both American and British inquiries were launched immediately, and that's when the White Star Line went into damage control mode. Their strategy was simple: shift the blame away from cost-cutting decisions and design flaws. They blamed the captain for going too fast. They blamed the crew for not seeing the iceberg sooner. They blamed the lookouts for not having binoculars, conveniently omitting that the binoculars were locked in a cabinet and the officer with the key had been reassigned before departure. They even blamed the iceberg itself, calling it an unprecedented anomaly. What they didn't do was take responsibility for the inadequate safety systems. During the British inquiry, the question of watertight compartments came up. Why didn't the bulkheads extend to the top deck? The White Star Line's answer was masterful deflection. They claimed the ship met all legal requirements. They claimed the design was state-of-the-art. They claimed no one could have predicted this scenario. All technically true, all deeply misleading. Thomas Andrews was dead, unable to testify about the safety recommendations that were rejected. Other engineers who knew about the design compromises were pressured to stay quiet. Careers were threatened. Testimony was carefully managed. The inquiries concluded that the Titanic disaster was a tragic accident caused by excessive speed and unfortunate conditions. Recommendations were made: more lifeboats, better training, ice patrols. But the fundamental truth, that profit-driven design decisions killed 1,500 people, was buried. For decades, the official narrative held. The Titanic was a noble ship that met a tragic fate, a cautionary tale about hubris and nature's power. Documents about the rejected safety systems, lost in archives, internal memos about cost-cutting, destroyed or never made public. Testimony from designers who recommended better safety features, dismissed as hindsight. The White Star Line eventually merged with Cunard in 1934, and the corporate records became even harder to access. By the 1950s, most people who knew the truth were dead. The Titanic became legend. Movies were made, books were written, but they focused on the romance, the heroism, the tragedy, not the negligence. Then, in 1985, Robert Ballard found the wreck. The discovery reignited interest. Researchers began diving deeper, not just into the ocean, but into historical records. What they found was damning. Internal White Star Line communications revealed executives knew about advanced safety systems and chose not to implement them to save costs. Engineering assessments from the period showed multiple experts had warned the bulkhead design was inadequate. Testimony that was minimized in the original inquiries was re-examined and found to be accurate. The truth emerged. The Titanic sank because a company prioritized profit and luxury over the safety of the people on board. So, what exactly could have prevented the disaster? First, full-height bulkheads. If the watertight compartments had extended to the top deck, the water couldn't have cascaded from one compartment to the next. Even with 6 compartments breached, the ship would have stayed afloat long enough for rescue. Cost to implement? About £25,000. Second, a proper double-hull design. Instead of a single layer of steel plating, 2 layers with space between them. When the iceberg struck, the outer hull would breach, but the inner hull would remain intact. This technology existed and was being used on some ships. The White Star Line chose not to use it. Cost? About £30,000. Third, adequate lifeboats. Enough for every single person on board, plus extras. Cost? About £5,000. Total cost to make the Titanic truly unsinkable? Around £60,000. The ship cost £1.5 million to build. We're talking about a 4% increase in construction costs. For that 4%, 1,500 lives could have been saved, but it would have meant slightly smaller first-class suites, slightly less open deck space, slightly lower profit margins, and that was unacceptable. Here's the disturbing part. This wasn't unique to the Titanic. After Titanic sank, regulations improved. Ships were required to have enough lifeboats for everyone. Ice patrols were established. Radio communication protocols were standardized. But the fundamental problem, corporations prioritizing profit over safety, didn't change. The Titanic's sister ship, Britannic, was completed with improved safety features after the disaster. It survived a mine explosion in 1916, but sank anyway because portholes were left open, flooding the ship. Decades later, we see the same pattern. The Challenger space shuttle disaster, corners cut, engineers overruled. 7 dead. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Safety systems bypassed to save time and money. 11 dead. Ecosystem devastated. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes. Software issues known but not properly addressed. 346 dead. Every single time, the story is the same. Engineers raise safety concerns. Executives calculate that addressing them is too expensive or inconvenient. Disaster follows. Inquiries find fault. Regulations tighten. But the next company finds new ways to cut corners. And people die. The Titanic didn't sink because of an iceberg. It sank because executives in a boardroom decided that £60,000 was too much to spend on safety systems that would slightly reduce luxury and profit. 1,500 people paid for that decision with their lives. Thomas Andrews, the man who designed the ship and begged for better safety features, went down with it. His last hours were spent knowing that the disaster was preventable, that the people dying around him didn't have to die. He knew, the executives knew, and after the sinking, they made sure the world didn't know. For over 70 years, they got away with it. Today, the Titanic rests at the bottom of the Atlantic, a monument to hubris, a warning we keep ignoring. Because here's the truth that history keeps teaching us, and we keep refusing to learn. When profit is prioritized over people, disasters aren't accidents. They're inevitabilities. The archives are full of stories like this, preventable tragedies, buried truths, lessons unlearned. This is why Untold Archives exists. If you want more forgotten history, subscribe. Next week, we're uncovering another story they didn't want you to know. The truth is down there. We just have to be willing to dive deep enough to find it.